The blood on my daughter's sundress was not hers. It was her grandmother's, and Karen stood there, trembling, one hand still half raised like she hadn't yet decided if she was the victim or the threat. Her HOA lanyard dangled over her chest, twisting in the wind like a warning flag no one had seen soon enough. The gun, small, pearl-handled, ridiculous in any other setting, was on the ground now, but that didn't matter. The damage had already been done. My daughter clutched my leg, her wide eyes looking for something to make sense of what she'd just witnessed. I bent to cover her with my arms, shielding her from the chaos spiraling around us. Screams echoed from across the lawn. Someone had called 911. Someone else was still filming, breathless, as if capturing trauma through a lens somehow made it manageable. Karen didn't know who I was. Not yet. To her, I was just another mother at a picnic, one more name in the neighborhood directory. But as I stood and turned toward her, something in my posture made her flinch. Maybe it was the way I looked at her. Maybe it was the certainty. I wasn't coming as a mother now. I was coming as the deputy commissioner. I didn't want a house in a neighborhood governed by an HOA. I had said that clearly when we first started looking. Give me a little land, a stretch of quiet road, a backyard where my daughter could dig in the dirt and not get written up for having a garden bed out of symmetry. But my husband loved the layout, and my mother-in-law fell in love with the nearby school. They both promised the HOA was hands-off, just a newsletter, just a trash can rule here and there, nothing that would ever touch us. For the first few months, they were right. The community was clean, quiet, and perfectly bland. Every lawn was trimmed to the same height, every garage door the same approved color. It felt safe, like a model village plucked out of a brochure. But that safety was brittle. You could feel it crack if you leaned too hard on it. Karen introduced herself the first week we moved in. She came with a clipboard and a lemon pie that was probably store-bought. She smiled too hard and held her arms too close to her sides, like she wanted to be liked, but didn't know how to make it happen without a set of rules to hide behind. She called herself the Community Liaison, which I learned later was a title she had given herself after the real liaison stepped down. She had folded herself neatly into the vacuum of authority and filled it with policy reminders, bullet-pointed agendas, and emails that always arrived with the same subject line, friendly notice. At first, her presence was easy to ignore. I was working nights at the time, running operations for the department during a stretch of high-level investigations that kept my badge in my glove box and my hair in a bun. No one in the neighborhood knew who I was. I liked it that way. I didn't want my daughter to grow up with whispers or side eyes when she scraped her knees. I wanted her to play, to laugh, to think the world was still soft. My mother-in-law moved in with us just after Maya turned 6. She had retired early and wanted to help. She was the kind of woman who remembered birthdays, baked without recipes, and never let a dish sit in the sink for longer than 10 minutes. Maya adored her. The plan for the picnic had been simple. A few families, paper plates, music low enough not to offend the sound ordinances. It wasn't even an official HOA event, just us, in the common park area. Everyone had been invited. Everyone but Karen, technically, because no one thought to include her on the group text. Not out of malice, just oversight. But with Karen, omission carried the weight of insult. She showed up anyway. I was helping Maya pour juice into her little cup when I saw Karen round the path in her pressed slacks and that blue windbreaker she wore even when it was 80 degrees. Her mouth was tight, and she carried a tote bag instead of a purse, like she wanted to be ready to pass out pamphlets or citations at a moment's notice. My stomach sank, but I smiled. I always smiled when I saw her, the way you smile when you pass a dog that might bite if it sensed fear. My mother-in-law was by the grill, laughing with the Hendersons. Karen's eyes swept across the group like she was counting rule violations, like she was looking for the reason she hadn't been invited, and trying to turn it into a justification for action. I watched her nod to herself, once, sharply, as if a decision had just been made. I should have said something. I should have walked over and asked how she was, offered her a drink, softened whatever she'd built up inside herself, but I didn't. I let her stand there for a moment too long, unseen, unwanted, unnoticed. Some people carry that like gasoline. Karen was already searching for a match. The sun was high and unbothered, casting clean golden light over the park's trimmed grass and picnic blankets. Children darted between the trees, chasing foam rockets and swinging plastic bats at soap bubbles floating just out of reach. Laughter came in bursts, loose and genuine, rising above the soft hum of a Bluetooth speaker playing old-school Motown. It was the kind of afternoon you forget to be suspicious of. The kind that makes you think maybe people can just be kind. Maybe it really is that simple. I had my shoes off. My daughter was sitting beside me, sticky-handed and beaming, her face painted with a wobbly pink butterfly thanks to one of the teenage girls who'd brought brushes and a folding chair. My husband was talking with a few of the dads near the coolers. My mother-in-law had taken charge of the grilled corn, humming to herself as she flipped cobs with tongs she always packed just in case. She wore her straw hat tilted back, face glowing with sweat and joy, comfortable in a way that reminded me of my own mother before the illness took her. It was good to see her like that. Free, helpful, home. Karen lingered near the perimeter, standing on the path like a sentinel waiting for provocation. No one asked her to leave. No one welcomed her either. That was the trouble. She didn't understand how to blend into something not centered around her, and the silence must have felt like exile. She walked the edge of the scene twice before finally approaching, her steps deliberate, her tote bag bumping against her thigh. She began small, commenting on trash bag placement, asking who had coordinated the event, remarking that the communal grill technically needed to be reserved 72 hours in advance. My husband thanked her politely, brushing it off as a misunderstanding, and I followed suit. We had all learned the art of neighborly deflection. Nod, smile, move on. That usually worked. But Karen wasn't moving on. She walked over to where the kids were playing and told two of them to stop climbing the low fence. When one mother asked her not to discipline someone else's child, Karen stiffened and said she was only trying to prevent injury. The tone in her voice had changed. Something tight was unraveling. When my mother-in-law offered her a plate of food with that gentle grace only she could manage, Karen looked at it like it had been dipped in poison. She didn't even respond. Just turned her back and walked away. It should have ended there. One awkward neighbor, one ignored plate, a few passive-aggressive remarks. But she came back. She circled again, this time with something else in her hand. It wasn't the clipboard. It wasn't a flyer. It was her phone. She started taking pictures. Coolers, plates, the music speaker, license plates on parked cars. People shifted. The mood cracked a little. The sun kept shining, but we all felt the shadow arrive. She stood just a few feet from the center of the picnic, her phone raised like it gave her permission. Her eyes moved like a scanner, collecting evidence no one had asked her to find. Each photo clicked with quiet accusation. You could feel the temperature shift, not in the air but in the space between people. Conversations slowed, laughter softened. Parents began calling their children back from the edges, not out of fear, but out of something deeper, a sense that the moment was slipping from joy into something sharp. Karen didn't speak as she photographed. She didn't ask questions. She didn't smile. When someone laughed too loud near the speaker, she turned and zoomed in like the sound itself had violated code. A few people looked to me, and I felt that familiar pinch in my chest. The one that says, "You can step in now. You can fix this." But I was barefoot, holding my daughter's hand, and it felt wrong to put on the badge in that moment, even if only in spirit. My mother-in-law, as always, tried first. She approached Karen with calm in her step, a plastic fork in one hand, and that warm smile that rarely failed. She asked if Karen was okay, said she hoped she was enjoying the breeze, and mentioned how nice it was to see everyone together after such a long winter. She offered her a soda, motioned to a chair beneath a tree, tried to shift the story back towards something light, but Karen's mouth tightened. Karen said she didn't appreciate being left out. She said it was suspicious that no one had notified her. She said gatherings in the park without HOA coordination were technically discouraged and that her reports were always taken seriously. My mother-in-law kept her voice level and kind. She said it was just a casual get-together. No one had meant to exclude her. She offered again to get her a plate, or some fruit, maybe even a slice of the pie she'd brought herself. Karen raised her voice then, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to demand attention. She said the grill was out of regulation distance from the nearest tree. She said glass bottles weren't permitted on HOA grounds. She pointed toward the children and questioned whether they were being properly supervised. Her tone turned from firm to patronizing, from patronizing to invasive. She asked who was responsible for organizing the gathering. She asked who signed the rental agreement. No one had, because no one needed to. My mother-in-law tried one last time. She placed a gentle hand on Karen's elbow and asked her, very softly, to please take a breath and enjoy the day. Karen stepped back like she'd been burned. She said, loud enough now to stop conversations nearby, that touching her was a violation of personal space. Then she muttered something none of us heard clearly, reached into her tote bag, and walked away toward her car. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't, not even close. She didn't leave. That was the part no one understood right away. Karen walked toward the curb, her footsteps stiff, her bag swinging against her side. A few of us exchanged glances, assuming she was headed home, maybe to send a flurry of emails or file an official complaint with the HOA board. The mood tried to recover. People resumed conversations with half-hearted energy, and someone turned the music down a little, hoping to smooth out the edges. My daughter asked if she could go get another cupcake. I nodded, distracted, eyes still trailing Karen's retreating figure. But she didn't go home. She opened the door to her car, reached inside, and rummaged through something on the passenger seat. She was too far for me to see exactly what she was doing, but I felt a twitch in my stomach. It wasn't anything overt. It was the stillness. The kind that follows when someone prepares for a moment they've been imagining for far too long. She came back with something pressed to her chest. At first I thought it was another folder or clipboard. Then I saw the glint. It caught the sun for a split second, a metallic flash that could have been a keychain or sunglasses, but my instinct didn't hesitate. I rose from the picnic blanket, brushing crumbs off my jeans, and took a few slow steps toward the center of the lawn. My mother-in-law hadn't moved. She was still at the grill, chatting with one of the older couples about the seasoning on the corn. She didn't see Karen return, not at first. Karen walked straight toward her, her face pale and tight, her eyes locked forward with the kind of focus that doesn't blink. She passed 3 children without even noticing them. A boy dropped a football in front of her and froze when she stepped over it without a word. Someone laughed nearby. Someone else started to speak, and then stopped. I wasn't the only one watching now. Karen reached the edge of the picnic tables and stopped. She raised her voice again, calling out that the gathering was unauthorized and that she had informed the HOA board. She said this was the last time she would be ignored, the last time anyone here would act like the rules didn't matter. People turned, confused. A few tried to calm her, offering to talk, to find a solution. She raised her hand. That's when I saw the gun. It was small, silver, absurdly out of place in her hand. Her fingers trembled, but her grip was real. I froze for half a second, torn between the distance and the fact that my badge was locked away at home. No backup, no radio, just instincts and years of training behind the eyes of a mother at a picnic. I stepped forward and shouted her name. Karen flinched. Her hand jerked. The gun shifted. The shot rang out. People screamed. My daughter dropped her cupcake. And my mother-in-law fell. It didn't look like the movies. There was no slow-motion tumble, no dramatic clutching of the chest. She just dropped. A noise came out of her, soft and short, like a gasp swallowed by surprise. She landed hard, her head striking the grass beside the grill, the corn rolling into the dirt. I ran. Karen stood still, the gun slipping from her hand, her mouth hanging open like she hadn't meant to pull the trigger. Maybe she didn't mean to. Maybe she thought the threat would be enough. Maybe she thought her words and her clipboard had always been enough and the gun was just another symbol. But she had fired, and everything had changed. The sound of the gunshot didn't echo. It just sank into the hot afternoon air like a stone into still water. At first there was only silence, that stunned, stretched kind of silence where nothing fits. Then came the screams, sharp and frantic, rising all at once like someone had torn the calm in half. I dropped to my knees beside my mother-in-law. Her eyes were fluttering, her breath shallow and fast. The blood was spreading across her side, soaking into her shirt and pooling against the warm grass. I pressed my hands to the wound without thinking, trying to stanch the bleeding, trying to hold her together with nothing more than pressure and whispered promises. I told her she was going to be fine. I told her Maya was safe. I told her not to close her eyes. My daughter was crying behind me, somewhere just out of reach. I wanted to turn around, to pull her into my arms and shield her, but I couldn't move. My hands were red, my knees were wet. I could hear someone calling 911, voice shaking, giving directions and trying to explain what had just happened in a sentence that made no sense. There had been a picnic. There was a woman with a gun. Someone's grandmother had been shot. Karen stood where she had dropped the weapon, staring at her own hands like she didn't recognize them. She didn't run. She didn't speak. Her mouth opened once, then again, but no sound came out. It was as if she were waiting for someone to undo what had just happened, as if this were still a meeting, still a matter of procedure. A man tried to approach her, but she stepped back, nearly tripping over the curb. The gun lay on the grass, a few feet away, gleaming in the sun like it was proud of what it had done. I pressed harder. My mother-in-law grimaced, but she didn't speak. Her breathing was slowing, her skin turning cold. I knew the signs. I had seen them too many times in the field. I kept whispering to her, not to comfort her, but to hold her there with me. She was the heart of our home, and now that heart was bleeding out in my arms, because a woman with a tote bag and a clipboard decided the rules were more important than a life. The ambulance took 10 minutes to arrive. I counted every one of them. My hands never left her body, and I barely blinked. Someone had handed me a towel from a cooler bag. It was floral, thin, not nearly enough, but I folded it tight and kept pressure on the wound. Blood still came through. I could feel it on my fingers, sticky and warm. My daughter was kneeling beside me now, her tiny arms wrapped around my back, her face buried in my side. She didn't speak. Her shoulders shook with quiet sobs that didn't match the noise around us. People were shouting, pacing, pointing at Karen, who still hadn't moved far. Someone took her phone. Someone else stood between her and the children. The music had stopped. The speaker had been knocked over during the panic, but no one picked it up. The silence it left behind was worse than the screams. My husband arrived at my side and touched my shoulder. I shook my head, not ready to let go. He crouched down and took Maya into his arms, shielding her face, whispering into her hair. I don't know what he said. I just kept pressing, listening to the slowing breath beneath my hands, praying for a siren. When the EMTs ran up the path, I gave them just enough room to work. One of them asked questions. The other checked her vitals. I answered everything without thinking. Entry wound, right side. No exit. Shallow pulse. Slowed responsiveness. I used short, sharp language, the kind I had used at a dozen other scenes, but this time I wasn't wearing the badge. They lifted her onto the stretcher with practiced care, and I saw her eyes flutter open for half a second. She looked at me, then at Maya, then closed them again. I followed them to the ambulance until they asked me to step back. I didn't argue. I just watched the doors close and the lights flash red against the park's perfect green. Karen was sitting on the curb now. Her hands were clasped in her lap. Her face looked pale, like she had just stepped out of a dream she didn't like. She still hadn't spoken, not even to say she was sorry. Maybe she didn't know how. Maybe she thought it was still about the rules. She hadn't yet realized what she had done to a family, to a child, to me. I walked toward her slowly. My shoes were soaked through with blood and wet grass, but I didn't notice the weight until I got closer. Karen sat hunched, arms wrapped around her knees like a child caught in a storm she didn't understand. She looked up when my shadow crossed over her, eyes wide and blinking as if she had only just remembered the world around her. She opened her mouth to speak, but I raised a hand and she went quiet. I'm going to need you to stay seated, I said. There was something in my voice that made her eyes flicker. Authority, maybe, or certainty. She looked at me harder now, like she was trying to place me, like the edges of some puzzle had just started to come together. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my wallet, flipped it open to the badge, held it there for just long enough. Karen's mouth opened again, this time with a sound behind it. Not a word, just breath. I'm the deputy commissioner of this city, I said. You've just discharged a firearm in a public space, shot an unarmed woman, and endangered a child. You're going to stay right where you are until the officers arrive. Do you understand me? She nodded, barely. Her hands twitched in her lap. For the first time since it all began, she looked small, not in size, but in spirit. Like the version of herself she had built, the one with control and rules and laminated signs, had crumbled in her hands the moment that trigger clicked. I could see people watching from a distance. Neighbors with wide eyes and phones lowered now, unsure if they should approach. Some of them knew me now. They remembered the news segments, the briefings. Some of them didn't. It didn't matter. Karen knew. She started to cry. Quiet, strangled sobs that came out with her chin tucked to her chest. I didn't comfort her. I didn't kneel. I stood there, steady, and waited. When the first patrol car pulled into the lot, I turned and walked to meet it. The officer stepped out, and his expression changed as soon as he recognized me. He opened his mouth, but I shook my head. "She's on the curb," I said. "Weapon was recovered near the east tree. Witnesses everywhere. I want her processed by the book." He nodded, already reaching for the radio clipped to his vest. I looked back once before stepping away. Karen was still sitting there, hugging herself. She had finally realized who I was, but more than that, she realized what she had become. And it was too late to take any of it back. They took her without incident. No cuffs, not at first. She stood up when they asked, didn't resist, didn't argue. She walked to the squad car with the slow, disconnected steps of someone not quite inside their body. I watched from across the lawn, standing beneath the same tree where my daughter had chased Bubbles an hour before. The world looked different now, sharper around the edges. Neighbors lingered in clumps, whispering low and glancing over at me with the kind of uncertain awe people reserve for headlines. Some looked ashamed, some looked relieved. A few avoided my gaze entirely, like they weren't sure if they'd been on the wrong side of something and didn't want to find out too late. One man came up to me and said he had never liked Karen, said she always took things too far. I didn't respond. Another neighbor, an older woman with sunspots on her cheeks, handed me a folded blanket and asked if I needed water. I thanked her quietly, not because I needed it, but because I knew she did. Karen sat in the back of the cruiser with her head down. Her lanyard was gone. One of the officers had bagged it with her belongings, though it still felt like it hung in the air, the way all symbols do after they're stripped away. She didn't look at me as they closed the door. She didn't look at anyone. Inside the house that night, my daughter refused to speak. She crawled into our bed with her stuffed rabbit and curled into my side. My husband made tea and didn't touch his. We sat in silence, checking our phones every few minutes for an update from the hospital. When the call finally came, it was a nurse. The bullet had missed anything vital. My mother-in-law was stable, sedated, expected to recover with rest and monitoring. Relief came heavy, not like a weight lifted, but like another weight layered over exhaustion. I cried for the first time that day, quietly, into my daughter's hair. The next morning I called the chief and explained everything. He already knew. He told me to take time, but I declined. I wanted to be there when the charges were filed. I wanted to watch the booking. Not because I needed vengeance, but because I believed in what I had sworn to uphold. The law doesn't mean anything unless it reaches all of us. Even in quiet neighborhoods with clean lawns and newsletters printed on pastel paper. Karen was charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment, and unlawful discharge of a firearm in a public space. Her lawyer argued that she had not intended to shoot, that she had panicked, that she had only meant to frighten. But the video footage from 3 phones told a different story. So did the witnesses. So did the blood on my hands. When the court date came, I sat in the gallery in plain clothes, no badge, no title on display. Karen didn't look at me as they read the charges. Her lawyer did, just once, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. Maybe he hadn't believed her when she said who I was. Maybe he had thought she was exaggerating. But there was no room for exaggeration anymore. Only fact. My daughter didn't come to court. She was in school that day, painting with watercolors, her innocence protected for a little while longer. Karen left the courtroom in cuffs. And I walked out into the light, not as the deputy commissioner, but as a mother who had kept her promise to never look away when it mattered most. My mother-in-law came home 2 weeks later. The wound would heal, the doctors said, though the scar would stay. She moved slower now, but her hands were just as gentle. Maya stayed close to her those first few days, always watching, always reaching for her hand. Sometimes at night, she would ask if the lady was gone. We told her yes. We didn't tell her where or for how long, just that she wouldn't come back. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and cards. Some brought flowers, some brought excuses. They meant well, I think, but none of them had stopped Karen before she crossed a line. They had let her build herself into something untouchable, and no one had questioned why she needed to be feared to feel seen. The HOA sent a letter. It apologized for the incident, offered to reimburse for medical costs, and promised new guidelines for board elections. They didn't mention her name. They never said the word gun. We went back to the park a month later. Just the three of us. No decorations, no crowd. Just a blanket under the trees, and the sound of children playing in the distance. Maya held her grandmother's hand and laughed when the wind caught her napkin and sent it flying. For a moment it felt normal again. I watched them from a few feet away, my badge resting in my purse beside a half-eaten sandwich. There will always be people like Karen. People who mistake power for importance, who see rules as weapons instead of boundaries. But as long as I breathe, they won't have the last word. Not in my city. Not near my family. Not while my daughter is still learning what safety is supposed to feel like.